Okay, my name is Lisa Diane Wedgeworth, and welcome to Conversations About Abstraction. I'm really excited about our conversation today. I'm excited about all of our conversations. And before we start, I'd like to share with you that this presentation is for educational purposes only, that the thoughts, ideas, observations, analysis of any work is the intellectual property of the participating artists, and that if you are going to share this work in any of your classes with students, we would appreciate you reaching out to us to share with us the response of your students. It's always great to hear what students think when they are listening to artists speak about their work. But this work cannot be published or sold or copied without consent of Conversations About Abstractions or the participating artists. And individual recording of this presentation is prohibited. We have a few upcoming conversations that we're really excited about. So please be mindful of them and add them to your calendar. They will take place approximately every 2 weeks, always on a Sunday and at 1 p.m. Sam Vernon earned her MFA in painting and printmaking from Yale University in 2015 and her BFA from the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art in 2009. Her installations combine Xerox collages, photographs, paintings, and sculptural components in an exploration of personal narrative, identity, and historical memory. Sam teaches in the Print Media and Graduate Fine Arts program as an assistant professor at California College of the Arts, CCA, and Bard College as a visiting assistant professor in studio arts. Please welcome her to the conversation. And Glen Wilson received a BA from Yale University, New Haven, Connecticut, and an MFA from the University of California, San Diego. His solo exhibition, Slim Margins, opened at various small fires in October 2020, last year. Recent group exhibitions include the California African American Museum, the Museum of Contemporary Art, Honor Fraser, Quotidian, among others. Wilson received a Schomburg Research Fellowship from the New York Public Library Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in Harlem, New York. So I want to introduce a new platform today. Predominantly, this conversation will take place between Sam and Glen, and I've always envisioned the conversations about abstraction being just that, a conversation, in the guise of what would happen if these two artists met each other in their studios, what conversations would they have about their practice, their work, abstraction, life, whatever comes up. So I will be here to moderate a bit, but we really will be hearing a lot from Glen and Sam. And put your hands together and welcome them. And it is all you guys. I'm happy to have you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, Lisa. It's an honor to be in this conversation with you, Glenn. I've
Thank you.
admired your work. And it's great to be able to take a deeper dive into it. So I'm excited to talk to you more. Yeah, I'm Sam, pronouns she, they. Was born in Brooklyn, New York, raised in Connecticut and Maryland, went to school in New York and Connecticut. So very much an East Coast background. So I thought I would start with this image because it's an image that my mother actually took of me as a child that I incorporated into a photo series when I was an undergrad, trying to unpack my middle class background, trying to really dig into identity and figure out how I could make work about so many things, including my positionality as a young Black femme, to the archive, and to really weighty, difficult, challenging images that I was being confronted with, having to do with sort of post-slavery and a lot of unpacking of drawings and newspaper clippings and all kinds of, you know, materials that I knew were an important part of my legacy. a path to freedom that allowed me to live the way I did, grow up the way I did, and also have access to education, to read, to make art, which was not the case for my grandparents or my great grandparents. So I really wanted to look into my own background in history through the lens of trying to think about a lot of this archival content. And that's something that stayed with me really throughout my career. When I made this collage, this sort of photo montage, I was, how old was I? 19 or 20 years old. And I'm 33 now. So I just wanted to start here because it sort of felt foundational to not only the kind of conversations I want to have with Glen later on about how we both use photography, but also just the power of trying to use one's autobiographical content as a point of departure in abstraction. Next, please. So in thinking about my relationship to abstraction as well, I would be really remiss if I didn't mention artists like Sister Gertrude Martin, Thornton Dial, Bill Trailer. These are vernacular artists coming out of the South with a legacy that my family certainly shares, and I feel like they are artists that I didn't learn about in school per se, but are artists that made it possible for me to think about my relationship to many different ways of telling a story about loss, telling a story about origin, and also being able to use fiction and the potential of my imagination to access the materials and things around me to be able to make something larger than I could ever draw or paint. And so I began to tap into interdisciplinary installation early on in my making as a way to take up space, as a way to elaborate on the many different iterations of my thoughts and ideas. And so my first solo show was actually through a fellowship at AIR Gallery. AIR Gallery is the first artist-run, women's-run space in this country that was established by incredible artists like Howardina Pindell, who I love. Her abstractions have been such a huge influence on me, and Nancy Spiro, as well as many others. Ana Mendietto was also involved at some points. So AIR is a historical treasure, and so to be invited into the space and be able to have my first show there was incredible. The show was called Think on It, Then Lay It Down for Good, and it was inspired by Toni Morrison's Beloved. Next, please. Fast forward to 2015, I was wrapping up grad school and really wondering about my agency within the institution and how I could continue to bring back selfhood, center my own personhood, my own story within such a kind of very competitive, very intense environment that was the graduate program there. So I decided to proceed again with an installation. This one is called Self-Portrait with 12 Boxes. There are 12 plexiglass donation boxes filled with different elements, including inky water, sand, textiles, prints, fabric. In the back is a pile of images and work that just didn't work out in the studio that I also wanted to put on display as a nod to sort of the vulnerability of the studio practice, as well as 2 vinyl posters with photographs of a abandoned building and 2 4x8 walls that have Xerox drawings of mine. wheat pasted onto their surfaces. Next. I was right out of grad school, pretty active, which was amazing. And I was invited to do a large scale installation at the Queen's Museum. So that gave me an opportunity. Oops, sorry. Thank you. That gave me an opportunity to do a deep dive into Louis Armstrong, who I always knew was a collagist in his own right. He, for over 40 years, made incredibly beautiful collages on the surface of different records. And he used newspaper clippings and magazine clippings and all this, and installed his work in his home in Queens, and until his wife asked him to take it down because she thought it was tacky. So that's just a little story that I had seen and heard about when I was living in Queens, but I really wanted to look into his artistry. So I created this wall dedicated to a kind of imagined relationship between him and I. Next. My first solo show in California was at Ashara Ukundayo Gallery. You know, Ashara is a very important person to me because I moved to California almost 4 years ago, and I did not have any friends or family really in the Bay Area or in California that were like kind of close to Oakland, where I was living at the time. So I was thrilled to be able to have access to her space, and I met a man who owned a flea market, and he graciously sort of gave me a ton of Jet magazines, and so I was able to incorporate them and hang them from these kind of strings and celebrate so much of the rich Black history and Black cultural production that's in the Bay Area, but also comment on how violent and difficult displacement and gentrification has been in that area. This gallery, unfortunately, no longer exists. Next. My latest show that's currently on view at MIM Gallery in Mid-City in Los Angeles is called Future Shock. It's based off of the 1970 book by the same title, Future Shock, by Alvin Toffler and his wife, Adelaide Farrell. I think it's important to always look to the past. I think the past, we kind of carry the past with us, and it informs our present consistently. And so I wanted to take a look back on this book in particular, because it got a lot of things right in terms of a sort of futurist ideology in which we live in a society where technology is so fast-paced, and especially in the midst of pandemic, is causing us to even have talks like this online and looking at art differently, and so many things, so many parts of our lives differently. So I wanted to comment on that, and this is what came out of my investigation. Next. So I also have been working on these paintings that are part of the show that are exhibited in different ways throughout the space, and I haven't really shown paintings like this, I would say, really ever within my career. I mean, I've been working on these paintings for the past 2 years, and so it feels very special to introduce them to my public as new, fresh work in Los Angeles. Next. And then I also love print, and I teach print, and print media is not only important in the installations, as you probably saw, but it also functions for me in many ways. And I recently debuted a book to honor Belkis Seyon, Afro-Cuban printmaker who passed at a really early age. She was 1 year younger than me when she died. And I've always had a very strong sort of creative connection to Belkis. And I saw her work many times when I was on the East Coast, and I hope to get to Cuba to experience her country as well. But her work is just so masterful, so deep and rich. And I think also abstract in many ways, texturally. So I wanted to create a dialogue with her and also acknowledge that the way that she tapped into grief and joy and research was something that I deeply admire and wanted to pay homage to her in a sense. So this book is available through Floss Editions, and Sun Night Editions screen printed the cover. So I'm very happy to have had that released. When was it? Last month, actually, this came out. So that's it for me. Thank you. Actually, no, next slide. When I was thinking about, this is what I forgot, I kind of threw this in here last minute. When I was thinking about Glen, I thought of this Basquiat that he made in 1981. It's called Three Kinds of Fences. And so I kind of wanted to shape this as an interlude into Glen's conversation about his work. So I pass the mic to you, Glen.
Glen, you're muted.
Amazing, Sam. Thank you very much. You can go on to the next slide, Lisa. Thanks for inviting me, and thank you, Sam, for being willing to freestyle a conversation on a Sunday afternoon. And I welcome everybody to the space. And I guess I'll just sort of jump right in. And by the way, thank you, Lisa, for always being thinking of really interesting platforms and being supportive of your fellow artists. You're the perfect person in that role, and it's a special contribution to the fabric of our broader community. So, bio. I've lived in Los Angeles since 19. In the same spot with my family, wife and two sons. But I've lived in California since '92. As you mentioned in the brief bio, I came to Cali from Chicago, by way of Chicago, to attend graduate school. And prior to that, as you also mentioned, I was in New Haven for 4 years for undergrad. Cool connection with Sam. And I'm originally from Columbus, Ohio, very much a Midwestern kid, which is also, Lisa, you and I have connections around Ohio as well. This first slide is a good way to kind of sort of jump into my practice, because a lot of my studio practice spilled from being almost exclusively in my studio into public view in October in 2020, when I had the opportunity to put together a show at various small fires called Slim Margins. It was organized in collaboration with Dr. Joe Moniz, who played a really rich, interesting role in terms of just conversation, dialogue about the work that I wanted to include in the show. It was interesting to think about staging my first relatively expansive solo show in Los Angeles, though I have had opportunities to show my work, including at Project Space 2920, hosted by Lisa years ago. It was the first opportunity for me to really stretch out with my practice, which originates very much in the realm of street photography, but has taken on a much more sculptural, installative language and presence. And you can see some of that manifesting here in the the work that was in the courtyard that you immediately walked into when you came into Slim Margins. As a street photographer at the root, I've always been interested in the engagement between myself, as the practitioner or the person using this representational tool, and the space that I inhabit, and then share. And I think of the photograph as a beyond its sort of traditional role as a reflection or representation of a moment or a series of moments. I also think of it as a point of collision, between myself, the sort of private realm, and the public self as well, the public realm. And I'm interested in the multiplicity, the multiple perspectives that can be embodied in a work that originates photographically. Before we go on to the next slide, I'll just say that there are three pieces here. Obviously, the one here in the foreground is called Immaculate Sundial, and the two in the background are part of a larger ongoing series that I've been engaged in since 2013, 2014, called Gatekeeping, salvaging materials from my neighborhood primarily, but all in Venice Beach where I live, but also other neighborhoods or that I've had opportunities to either live or work in for any extended period of time. Oftentimes communities that have very similar dynamics as the one that my family and I live in, sort of along the lines of what Sam alluded to in Oakland. Next slide. So here's the reverse of Immaculate. I thought of this piece as a kind of a portal. And then obviously you saw on the reverse, the wood flooring, which actually came from my home here in Venice. And the iron railing came from a home that's been demolished down the block that it's leaning up against. But I think of this piece as a portal piece, a sundial, something that alludes to the idea of the passage of time, and also attempts to honor in a kind of quiet, sacred fashion the folks who have defined this neighborhood. I'm also interested in memory, collective memory, personal memory, but also thinking about how community and individual identity are similarly fluid, similarly intersectional, and defined largely by dichotomies. Public, private, as I mentioned, presence, absence, the idea of departure and the idea of arrival, and the tensions that are at those intersections. Next slide. So as you came from the courtyard into the gallery of the show, this was kind of the primary vista you were greeted with, which has three pieces. Again, two pieces that are incorporating the chain link material. On the right is a piece that I call Ibeji Racing Pharaoh's Light. It actually is the first piece in which I kind of nudged myself from a very comfortable space of street documentary into a more poetic sort of expansive space in terms of playing with notions of the sublime, notions of the figurative collapsing into a color field, that sort of thing. All of the gatekeeping pieces are woven into gates that I've salvaged from homes that are mostly demolished in this neighborhood. They're all double-sided. Centerpiece here, Covenant, is a real estate sign that I found discarded in the alley and kind of just worked with and engaged, thinking about housing, restrictive housing covenants. The piece in the background, Ritual Unions, is a piece, again, woven into the gate, into the chain link, but breaking out of the frame. Next slide. Again, each of the gatekeeping pieces has two sides, which gives me a little bit of room to play with the sensibility, again, to play with dichotomies and you know, have almost an A side, a B side, conscious, a subconscious, and official and unofficial. Next. The Abeji Racing Pharaoh's Light piece that was in the first installation view. This is this is the reverse of the left of those pieces. So you can actually engage the work, open it, and it reveals imagery on the reverse. Next. I haven't actually utilized this image in any context just yet, but I really love to show an image that kind of represents the origin point of a lot of the work before it ends up, you know, being woven and you know, enlarged and engaging another object, whether it's a gate or a discarded you know, garden tool or something like that. I wanted to show this image because I'm planning on working with it in an upcoming weaving, probably outside of a frame rather than within a gate frame, but we can talk more about this image. And to me, it's very much an image about the idea of being present, and I'll leave it at that. Try to speed this up. Here's a sketch that I made in Sugar Hill in New York, thinking about how Harlem has been having similar dynamics shaping its current reality as Oakland, Venice, Oakwood specifically here in Venice Beach. Next. The next three slides are just, again, an opportunity to share some ideas that I'm thinking about. Next. Next. All three of these images were made, well, the last two images were, excuse me, the first two images were made in Richmond, Virginia. And then this image was made in Mobile, Alabama. I've had an opportunity to do a lot of traveling with work that I do, oftentimes working in the context of a film, feature film sets. And obviously, in the interstitial moments that I have, you know, I go sort of looking for opportunities to explore ideas that I'm working on in my studio, but in those locations. And I've been obsessed with the idea of marker monuments, plaques, that have historical resonance. We can talk more about that. I don't know how many more slides there are. Next. Next. Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interject. This is your last slide.
All right, cool. This is a piece from an ongoing series called Broken Record, where I actually just been collecting ephemera, street debris that's kind of in a state of vanishing, and rephotographing it and presenting it in a manner to kind of bring out the syntactical nature of discarded objects, and thinking about how often what's discarded in the neighborhood is the unofficial narrative and the echo of an alternative mapping of the neighborhood.
So I know the two of you have questions that you've prepared for each other, but I would like to ask a question to kind of kickstart the conversation between the two of you. Sam, in her introduction to her work, talked about looking at the past and how that informs the present. And Glenn, with your work and the collection of found objects, your work so much represents the present as it does the past. The current situation with gentrification, people being erased from their communities, being moved out of their communities, and then you collect these artifacts that are also evidence of the past, of what once was, the evidence of people being in particular places and having existing, even though we don't see them anymore, in addition to the photography and the collection of these visual narratives. Can the two of you talk about looking at the past, informing the present, and vice versa?
Sure. I mean, that's a really it's a big question, but I think it's a important one because it really depends on where you start, and I love thinking about research, whether it's topical or like ambient or really focused, as a place where this reflection and study can happen. And so I feel that most of my life, I've been aware that my mother has been an incredible documentarian of my life, my sister's life, so many photos. She kept basically everything, plaques, awards, documents. She took tons of photos of us. Because I talked to her about this morning, actually, because I'm actually getting rid of a couple of some things and sort of shutting some of the stuff, and she was like, well, I didn't have much, so I wanted you to have what I didn't have. And I think that it's really important to remember that the violent erasure and detachment and sort of brokenness of the ways in which Black folks were able to establish their record keeping, their own record keeping, is increasingly important to me. I think that, there's a quote where it says, like, Black people have a fever for the archive, because that was Matt Richardson who wrote that, and it's so true. It's like we have so much that we're trying to piece together from the past, that was intentionally not provided. So many fights for access, so many fights for legibility. So that piece that you have at the very end, Glenn, that says broken record, is really, I think, quite metaphorical for a conversation around what it means to be consistently fighting for recognition, visibility, and access within the margins, right? Within consistently trying to recover material. So I really appreciate, the access points that you've provided in the found objects. And I too really love to work with that kind of material, specifically from a point of like scanning and repurposing what I find in like different documents and photos and stuff like that.
I think that when I sort of dove into your work, I thought immediately about the tensions between the stabilized and the destabilized, and also this idea of flow, because on the granular level, the closer you move in, forms are revealed and information is provided, or an answer to a question you may have at a distance. While at a distance, you're allowed to be enveloped in the rhythm that your repetitions and the layering and the buildup that you create with your artifacts. Like, I love that the slide that had the work installed. It had the donation boxes in the foreground, and then it had kind of like a reveal or an homage about process in the unused or the discarded studio pieces. And I love the freedom that I sense in all of your work. Can't wait to get down to the mid city to see the show. But at certain points, there's a kind of a familiar rigidity, and I think that has to do with stabilizing and the archive, or the suggestion or the evocation of the archive. And then there's also a freedom of right immediately right under those 4 panels on the back left. There's something that feels chaotic and very organic. And I mean, to me, it's actually soothing, whereas to another viewer, it could just be something disruptive or chaotic. But I think the tensions between the geometric forms that you're working with, like the donation boxes as these sort of perfect cubes, and these industrial locks that are a vernacular object that can be read from a distance as what it is, what it is, versus the back upper right piece leaning up against, it appears to be leaning against the wall, which also is using the rectilinear grid, and yet it's decaying, it's falling apart. And as looking at your other slides, I want to move in close to that, because the layering, the repetition, the reveal is going to be in those forms. So I sort of, in the same way that I was really excited to work with that really distinct image as a portal, I see that as a passage. In this slide, I see that back right piece almost as a passage into another space. So I really respect, and I feel like I'm given permission by observing your work, hearing you talk about it, to actually go on ahead and bust out of certain rigidities I might have about how I present my own work, or what's permitted to cohabitate in a space.
Wow, that's a huge compliment. Thanks, Glenn. I actually had a similar feeling when I was looking at your photos. I thought to myself, my goodness, they're just monumental. They're just so, they like your work, it specifically the work that you're showing around the portal, it's emblematic, right? And so when you start thinking about your work within a kind of codex of iconography, then I can begin to kind of pull out content from that. And imagine seeing this in person. I feel like I would have a similar experience as if I was in front of a monument of some kind, and so I feel like the refined quality of how you make and present your work does instill in it a sort of reverence, a kind of, even though within that reverence you have, found objects that have been tossed, or it's almost like you are imbuing a new sense of quality and I don't even like quality and connection to materiality. So it's kind of like a lifting up out of what was discarded into monument. Or it's that you're juxtaposing this recontextualization of the fences in the same room with, a discarded for sale sign post, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, that is a form of record keeping, you know.
Yeah.
And that's where I kind of see some ties, you know,
Definitely.
there as well. Yeah.
I have the fever for the archive. You know, that's a good quote. And by the way, when you talk about the reverence, you know, you boldly bring the autobiographical into your visual discourse, into your presentation of your body of work. And I often think that I am doing the same thing. And then I realize, you know, that I am not as necessarily transparent about it as some of our colleagues, like you and others. It's something that always informs the way I work. But just to say, like, with regard to this slide that's up right now, Immaculate, these are the hands of an elder in the neighborhood who is no longer with us, unfortunately, Miss Cooley. In fact, right here, this is the same sister right here. And she, I used to just bump into her frequently. And we would always say, you know, she had that old school approach, is that you always say hello. You always acknowledge, you always see each other. That's the fabric. And then at one point I must have said to her, you know, Miss Cooley, I am actually a visual artist and a photographer, and I would love to make a portrait someday, you know, if you'd be down for that. She's like, you know, she was very dear, very sweet. She's like, sure, sure. And so, you know, probably took 2 or 3 more times bumping into her. I finally was like, either I had my camera or I ran back and got my camera, is often the case. But the reverence that you're speaking of, it is autobiographical. It has to do with pursuing connections with ancestors, the folks who, you know, it's community, but it's also family. And it's also the way in which the archive, photographic or otherwise, allows folks to speak about community and personal identity. There's, at least the way I like to work, there's always a conversation that's happening. And I learned something about where I live. Inevitably, my sons have to hear the whole tale. But I become, you know, a keeper of neighborhood memory, you know. And the very first gate that I wove, you know, I had shared the idea damn near 2 years prior to actually executing it, but it was my neighbor who said, Glenn, come over here. I got something for you. And he pulled this gate out. I like to tell the story because it always blows me away. He takes me to his backyard and he says, gives me a gate. He says, do something with this. Because I had told him this idea a year or year and a half earlier, and he was holding on to it. And he was like, this dude needs to do this idea, you know? So anyhow, the idea of like past, like I want to be very careful. I don't know how you feel about this, but I want to be very careful of not, gentrification can be extraordinarily violent and cruel and calculated. You know, the violent aspect of it is the calculated aspect of it in many cases. But I also don't want to exclusively talk about erasure, because there's still opportunities to, and there needs to be a discussion about stakeholder status. Oakland is you know, anyhow, I'm going to stop there.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And you brought up dichotomies, and I think one of them is absence and presence, because it is a conversation about, so many times, about who's here, who's still here, who had to leave, who felt like they got pushed out, who decided to sell. These are the conversations that happen on the ground level, right? Yeah. Who are the new people? Who are the people who have been here? We talk about generations, right? We talk about, this is about inheritance. And so I often, when I give talks, I speak to the inheritance that I feel I'm so grateful to have, which is an inheritance of art making, a legacy of art making, but then also to have to be able to, like you mentioned, travel, to be able to see that what is happening in different cities and different towns across this country, as you said, is indeed calculated. Now, how do you bring the extent of a metaphor around what's happening and what you witness to the studio?
Yeah.
And be able to kind of re-articulate or investigate all of those feelings and ideas. And I feel that for a long time I was working in definitely a more figurative realm, and I decided to shift away from depicting into trying to get to more what this felt like, you know, how abstraction could get me closer to a kind of a emotional register that that could deal with the many ups and downs and entry points of what it is we're going through. So yeah, so this, thanks Lisa, this is a great example, because my arrival to the Bay Area was around 2017. And as soon as I arrived, folks were saying, "Oh, you missed it. You missed it." I said, "Well, what did I miss?" They said, "You missed peak Oakland. It's not the same anymore." And I said, "Well, you know, I'm seeing Black Joy parades. I'm seeing incredible amounts of creative work being done. I'm seeing beautiful Black families walking around. But I also know that yes, there was a huge amount of displacement, radical displacement and violence because of the prices, the tech stuff that have led to folks just leaving in droves, right? So how could I deal with, on one hand, the celebratory aspects of the culture that I was witnessing, and at the same time understand that the unhoused populations were mostly Black and brown folks in the Bay Area, and we have a huge population of unhoused people, unhoused folks. So at the intersection is where I feel like I come in, right? But also being able to connect, as you mentioned, with your neighbor. I connected with my neighbor who owned this flea market, and I saw that the name of the man who donated all of these Jet magazines, or sold them off or whatever, was consistent over the course of 25 years. It's all the same name, all the same address on these magazines. I don't know where he is now, or if he's still with us, but it is a timestamp, right? So I was really just trying this. I don't feel like this was the most successful installation I've ever made, but conceptually, I was trying to conflate this notion of Black cultural production with the Jet magazine being in production for decades and existing within our lives as a commuter magazine, but also as a staple of Black readership and content. But then it went out of print in 2014, around the same time that Oakland was changing,
And as a thread, I mean, I like the way that you have presented it on a line that can evoke anything from a power line to a clothing line. It's about currency, things that travel along a line, currencies, threads that run through and weave connectivity, which is also something that obviously I get into with weaving the imagery into the tense and kind of unforgiving metal mesh fabric. But and also I think you said this isn't what I think of as my most successful installation, but you mentioned it in your intro, this idea of taking up space.
Yeah.
You know, that's an act. That's an act of agency, and I think that you know, graffiti, you know, muralism that defines so much of the California urban space. It's about enunciating, taking up space, and leaving traces, and leaving like. It's funny that you and really cool actually that you pulled that Basquiat drawing, because if it was 81, there's a very good chance that he was here in Venice, getting ready to mount his first LA show, and was living probably like 4 blocks from where I'm sitting right now, 5 blocks probably. I've heard stories about when Basquiat was in LA and when Basquiat was in Venice, you know, and I'm obviously, I like to chronicle those things. So I get really excited. And the fact that it was one of his beautiful, simple drawings of 3 different kinds of fences: barbed wire, picket, and chain link. And I think the pieces that he presented, in his first show in LA, I think it was like a Gagosian or something like that, had the element of the picket fence that he had pulled as discards from the neighborhood. So when you arrived in Oakland and you supposedly missed peak Oakland, you know what I mean? The idea of, first of all, the idea of like, you missed it. You know, like there's something electric in just being able to have an exchange around the idea of, did you get it? Did you see it? Were you a part of it? Or did you miss it? You know, I love that frisson, like it happens, it's kind of like a necessary permanent part of the engagement. It's like, are we here or are we not here?
Yes.
Are we still doing this? Are we still making it happen? Are we still popping? Is this still ours? Yeah, it is. Oh no, well, it used to be this way, or it used to be that way. Or you should have seen, oh, you missed it. You know what I mean? Like, I love that. I love the spirit of engagement over, and again, the contested archive, the contested history of spaces, you know? Well, you would have seen, had you been here, you would have seen, you know, that same brother who gave me the first gate, he passed, I want to say, Aaron passed. Well, first of all, Aaron and Marzanne is still my neighbor 2 doors down. They came to LA by way of Reading. Reading? What is it right up by Oakland?
I think there is a Reading, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Northern California.
Yeah. Which was a big part of the southern sort of trajectory. You go to the Bay Area, and oftentimes you come back down to LA, find work. Folks, you know, spread out. Some family stays north, some come south. Anyway, he and I would sit up on his porch, and I just remember him saying to me one day, in his very quiet, impaired way, he had a tracheotomy, so like spoke very quietly. I'd have to always lean in. He said, you know, if you were a few years older and I was a few years younger, we would have run things. You know what I mean? He had this like vision. It was a vision of the past, the present, and the future collapsed, in which we would have stabilized the crazy vectors and velocities of white people moving into Venice Beach and, you know, reclaiming this little, you know, red-lined pocket of sweetness that was Black and brown. And I just love that. I always, like, when he said that, I felt so, I felt embraced, first of all, you know, because it flipped the moment from the reverence that I had for him as an elder into like, we were at the same level. He had become a younger man and I had become an older man. We had met there to somehow keep this neighborhood right. You know?
Yeah, it's an intergenerational conversation to have, you know, and the fact that you could have those conversations with an elder I feel is so special. That's something that I'm still working on, like connecting more with my community or the community of elders in the Bay Area, because sometimes there's silos that can happen. Like there's this,
Oh
art
yeah.
silo, academia, whatever,
Yep.
Your age can affect who you're crossing paths with, but
and family names too, like, oh, I
right,
don't associate with them, we don't associate with them,
right,
two
exactly.
blocks away,
Right, right. So I wanted to just ask you a little bit more about the weaving, if you don't mind, because
no.
it's so it feels like such a labor. And I'm constantly looking at art, and so I wanted to just bring some artists into the room to think about this labor. I don't know if you saw Paradise Lost by Chris O'Feely when he had the
Yes,
fences
yeah.
installed. And I'm also wanting to bring into the room Paul Anthony Smith, who did the Project Wall piece. And I'm wondering how you are thinking about fences as both a grid, a porous grid, but also the gate. There's the fence and the gate. Those feel like two separate pieces, and your emphasis has been on the gate with gatekeeping. I actually have a gate from a flea market in my studio that I've been thinking about, but I wonder how you think about filling in the grid with content, and if you are ever thinking about leaning more into like illegibility with that.
I think it's a push for me to think. It's an exciting push to think about illegibility, because that's actually what happens every time, when I decide to marry an image to a gate. I have to really sit with the gate, and I have to, no two gates are actually, even though it's an industrial process that creates it, no two gates are the same as far as, for example, the width in the mesh. It could be a 16th or an 8th, and that determining which it is will determine how I'm able to actually engage it and weave, and how I'm able to actually engage it and weave into it will then affect the illegibility question that you're alluding to, or directly actually asking. And this is a good slide. Thank you, Lisa. This is a great slide, because on the left you've got the piece that is more of what I'm thinking of as a tapestry that breaks out of the frame of the gate. And the frame of the gate is as you speak of in the context of your work, a very vernacular form. It's not dissimilar from the locks on the donation boxes. Immediately it's read as what it is, and it evokes, even in some cases, before the viewer, just in my observation, thinks about the image itself. Oftentimes there's a cascade of associations with the gate, and the way that even when you look at the different gates, there's patina on the edges where the human hand has touched thousands of times, and the oxidation is a little bit different. Obviously there are the scrolls at the top, and the gates are a mail order or a hardware store acquisition, modest, accessible price-wise, functional, demarcation rather than division or cloistering or enclaving. It's just a line to say, here's where the public begins, here's where the private begins, and here's where they meet. Breaking out of the gate was inspired by, if you see the cleavage point, that sort of in that triangular cleavage on the left, that is to me kind of a reference to the way in which you often see in urban spaces, and not just in urban spaces, but any spaces where chain link has been deployed, you know, folks will peel it back to gain access. And I love those moments. I mean, I notice those all the time now. I mean, I sometimes can't stop, you know, inhaling chain link, and it's such a in some ways it's meant to kind of fade into invisibility, but now it's hyper visible for me. So I like the tension in the gates. I feel that tension when I'm weaving into it. And then I like the looseness and the fabric quality of the mesh material when it's loosened from the gate. And I do feel, even though I'm not, you know, I'm not a textile artist, I love textiles. Actually, Diedrich Brackens had shown incredible work in the same space prior to me, and you know his work, I'm sure. The way he deals with the figure in his work, but also the materiality of his work, is just so incredibly evocative. And it felt like, okay, here is a response to the call of the materiality of his work represented in my work. And I hadn't anticipated that. It was kind of a really beautiful echo in a way.
I love that. Yeah, you can see it in the silhouettes for sure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that historically, of course, weaving is often associated in terms of community activity, is often associated with women, you know. So when I had my sons working with me to try to get a lot of, you know, work turned out, it feels like we're being just rhythmically given access to a sacred space of community connectivity. And you know, again, that's perhaps a little naive, but these things occur to me when we're all kind of in our flow, and one of my boys is working over there, the other's there, and I'm here, and we're all, and you know, I need you to come over here and snap this in, you know. So there's a very visceral, kind of unexpected thing that happens in that space as well. And I would like to turn the question around a little bit and ask you, because I imagine the physicality of your installations. They're vast and they're enveloping, and there are very distinct decisions made as to where points start and where they begin. And I'm wondering, is it improvisational? How much of it is improvisational? How much of it is rendered and sketched and anticipated? Or, you know, what is the balance that you create, and how does that work for you? You know, I've watched, yeah, you know what I'm saying?
I know what you mean. Thanks for that question. I really just try to meet myself where I'm at, Glenn. Like, sometimes, you know, between teaching and having a studio practice and also having other parts of my life, like, the deadlines around these shows are kind of moving targets, right? And so sometimes I'll be able to say, okay, I can do the site visit. I can have a good amount of time to start to prepare and envision what I want. Like in the case of the Queen's Museum piece, I was able to really plan for that and engage with the team there and do the research and do, you know, we reserved the cherry picker. We did all of this, and we knew this piece is, I want to say maybe 25, 20, I can't remember. I think it's like 25 feet high and 76 feet across, something to that effect. So we needed to have talks and preparation for this piece. But for smaller shows or more alternative spaces, sometimes the curator will just like kind of give me the key to the space, and I'm able to, over the course of several weeks, begin to just bring what I'm feeling about a larger theme iteratively to the space over a course of time. So I think of that more of like being an artist in residence, or, you
Yeah.
know, being able to work on a site-specific installation in a time-based capacity, which feels really good, because that's a different, yeah, I think that's a sort of different modality. It's certainly different methodology than kind of going in, having a week, flying back out. You know?
Right.
So,
Right.
So in a way, the work is pretty time based there,
Yeah.
and
I think
the
I
show
like
in
the word,
LA, yeah,
the word iterative that you use, like that. That is all your work is really all about iteration. You know, it's anyway. I interrupted you.
No, it's okay. Yeah, I think the show in LA is an example of where my intuition met a pretty worked out conceptual understanding of the space. I had previously had a show. I was in a show at the space about a year ago, and so when approached to do a solo show in the space, I was familiar with it, and I kind of knew that there was one long wall that I wanted to have this wheat pasted wall work on, and that I also wanted to bring in prints on organza and hang them in a similar way as how I was trying to work with some of those ideas around endless supply with the Jet magazines, kind of just having these textile forms drifting in and out of view within the space.
Mm-hmm.
I also knew that I wanted the paintings to coexist with all this. So it can be both. I think intuition is a powerful tool. Improvisation is, I think, key to my understanding of what abstraction is, and and how it functions in my life and in practice. So.
Yeah, nice. I actually really want to celebrate like the physicality as well, the flexibility and the stamina and the endurance aspect of doing work that is layered. You know, there's rigor, but then there's also just the physical engagement with the space. I wonder if you have done staging this kind of work in public view, not necessarily in the white cube. You know, not
Are you saying like more public art?
Yeah, just a public iteration of these pieces.
Yeah, I had I did a sort of large scale installation for the Olympic Sculpture Park, which is a very multi-purpose space. I mean, some people have gotten married in there. There's performances, people do yoga, concerts, all kinds of, you know, professional meetings, etc. But it's kind of like this meeting space in Seattle that's couched in the Olympic Sculpture Park that also has different public art pieces throughout the park, beautifully installed. You know, so you'll have like a Roxy Payne and then a Richard Serra, you know, and then the water, you know. So that was a beautiful opportunity. I was really happy to be able to tap into that. But I tend to, within my creative activism, do a lot of public facing work as well. So it doesn't always look like this, but it's still very much a part of my practice. But I just want to wrap up by saying I think both of our works, for me, like when I see how involved we are with installation, someone once told me your work is like a concert. You had to be there. And
I like that.
I feel that way about both of us. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you both. It has been wonderful to listen to you both talk about your work. And I'd like to ask you one question before we open it up to the audience. If either of you had to be an element of art, line, shape, color, texture, what would it be and why?
I'm gonna cheat. I'm gonna cheat. I'm gonna cheat. I'm gonna say I would like to be the groove on a piece of vinyl. So there's line,
Mm,
there's shape, and there's texture.
I like that.
Nice. I'm gonna cheat too, and I'm gonna say I want to be like water, like water,
Ooh,
because
yeah.
there's, there it holds everything.
Mhm, mhm.
Nice. Okay, so we're going to open questions up to the audience. Please feel free to send a message via chat, or you can unmute yourself. But I'd like for you, if there are quite a few people that have questions, to maybe just type in the chat question so I know to call on you. So, who has a question that they'd like to ask either Glenn, Sam, or both of them? I believe chat is open. Marley, is that the first name? Asks, Mr. Glen Wilson, I grew up with mostly seeing chain link fences in Chicago and had only thought of the urban decay aspect of them. I had never thought of the cultural, historical, and political significance. I love how you weave community into your work. Miss Sam Vernon, I love how your collaged memories weave into a coherent history. Would either of you like to respond to Marley?
Well, first, thank you, and then I think I'll pass it to you, Glenn.
Thank you for the positive vibration there. And Chicago is like kind of perfect um, ground zero for chain link in a way because the Sears Corporation, as most people who know Chicago know, shipped. It was the heart out of which a lot of everything from homes to pots and pans were sent via railroad all around the nation. And so as a result, it's because in a large part because of Sears that you find chain link all over the country. And that's kind of interesting historically when you think about uh, property and you think about class. Um, I grew up with a certain degree of, you know, certain assumptions about what markers of class would be on a property. And chain link was something you didn't necessarily in Columbus, Ohio, you didn't necessarily want to have on your property because it indicated something very particular. It
Mm.
wasn't until I moved to Venice Beach and to Oakwood in particular that I started seeing even those chain link fences with the Sears badges on them as badges of honor that spoke of modesty, hard work, stable neighborhood, middle class, the idea of discreetly dividing without or discreetly separating, demarcating without shutting out, being able to have a conversation with your neighbor, being able to see. It's all tricky and it's all complicated, but I like in the project that I'm engaged in the opportunity to kind of flip the script for myself and others potentially of changing the heritage or the interpretation of what the material is often thought to be, you know. So that's how I would respond to a really cool comment. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? I know there's a groovy question out there waiting to be asked. Well, I'll ask a question while we're waiting. Sam, you talked about improvisation and relating it to abstraction. I'd like for both of you, and I know with some people may not immediately recognize with Glenn's work abstract qualities because we have these. It's photo based. We have these real figures, recognizable figures. But I listened to Sylvia Snowden in a video interview, and she said, if I have a portrait of a person and I draw a circle around the eye, I have just abstracted it because this is no longer a representation of reality. And I'm interested in your thoughts with your work about abstraction. You have these grids, as Sam referred to them, these very clear diagonal spaces that are created within the work. abstracting the figure, somewhat. Can you talk about the employment of abstraction in both of your works?
I'll just hop in and say that I think about Jack Whitten a lot
Mhm.
as it pertains to this question. He's one of the people that I look to, and he said he describes African art as the DNA of visual perception. And then he says that the philosophy of jazz is making manifest a commitment to the expansion of freedom.
Mhm.
Both of those quotes really are very important to me as I think about abstraction as an improvisation.
Mhm.
And also as I study Islamic and African art, I see abstraction as already a Black thing.
Yeah.
So I'll leave it there.
I almost want to leave it there as well, but I think I think about process quite a bit.
Mhm.
It's not necessarily about the object that results from the process, but to the extent that you can invite engagement in the idea of the process, or lift your understanding of a vernacular object, like a gate or a lock affixed to a gate. You can step away from the vernacular implications or significations of the object and think of it as being a vessel that retains knowledge or information about a space that has been almost a metronomic kind of like a meter for a neighborhood. In the case of a gate, the openings and closings are as much a part of the gate as the gate itself.
Mm.
So I like to reserve that quality of the gate, no matter how I'm presenting it in a gallery space, and just even like the hesitation that people often feel when they're in a space that's an art space and they're realize that they can actually touch the gate and activate it exactly how it's always been activated. That's always a really interesting tension to me. So that thinking about abstraction as related to function
Mm.
and as related to process is kind of how I would answer that question. And I don't have a quote by Alan Toussaint, but talking about improvisation and jazz, he was one of the elder statesmen, epic, thinkers in the jazz community in New Orleans. And when so many people got displaced after Katrina, two things. One, there was a BBC documentary with him. He went up to New York, as so many musicians did, and the camera crew's following him around as he walks around, I think, in Midtown or Harlem. And at one point, he just walks from the intersection over to a street pole, to a light pole, and he just puts his ear up to the light pole, and he just like rests his ear. And this is like a, Miles Davis, like this is a jazz master, so to speak.
Mm.
And he puts his ear up to the pole, and he's like, you just have to listen.
Mm.
And the idea of like the abstraction of like suddenly it's no longer a light pole that emits light, but it still illuminates,
Yeah.
It's I thought that was interesting. And then thing number two was, and I was thinking about your piece, Sam, in collaboration with Louis Armstrong, which I love that. After Katrina, I've heard this story multiple times that Fats Domino's home in either the upper ninth or the lower ninth, there was a mobilization around his home, like saving all of the objects that were in his home. And I mean, it was like a community effort because things were happening where bulldozers were like piling up furniture and debris and detritus and so on. But folks protected his home and made sure that all the objects in his home could get to an archive beyond the archive that had been created just by virtue of his family home being intact. And I was thinking about that when you were talking about your piece. And just looking at all your various slides, it's kind of interesting. Again, the presence and power of the archive, and how a photograph, like I'm looking at the slide that's up right now, can fragment, and or if it's digital, can pixelate, it can fall apart and then be reconstituted. So anyhow, just kind of freestyling.
Thanks, Glenn. I just want to say, if anyone's interested in learning more about Louis Armstrong's collages, you can go online. There's an archive in which they're kept at Queens College in New York.
Wonderful, thank you. So Nicole Bell has a question, but before I ask the question on her behalf, Margaret just left a comment that says, no question here. Just want to say this has been a rich conversation full of poetry, history, and allusion. Thank you. Okay, so Nicole's question, and we'll take one more after Nicole, if there is one, before we close. In terms of photographic representation, you both seem to filter photographs through your own process. Glenn, I noticed you show maybe on the B-sides, Glenn, I noticed you show maybe on the B-sides, photographic negatives. Sam, you seem to use a lot of black and white, maybe Xerox-based photos. What role does that filtering play for you?
I'll just say that the Xerox has been a huge part of the sort of process of making. It comes out of seeing so many, like living in New York City for most of my adult life, and seeing so many posters, stickers, wheat pasted signs, etc., on the surfaces of walls and buildings everywhere, advertising anything from an upcoming performance to needing a babysitter. So I just grew up with all of these photocopies on streets and posted everywhere. And I would just also say that the immediacy of that kind of communication has always resonated with me, especially after 9/11, when you had people like literally searching, looking for folks, using Xerox copies and pasting them anywhere that there was a large amount of people to be able to find folks. And that was such a powerful, visceral memory that I have. So for me, the Xerox copy is accessible, it's immediate, it's urgent, and I can use it within my printmaking language to make multiples and disperse them. I can wheat paste them, I can hand them out, I can make little zines, I can just get the image out. So thanks for asking about the photocopies.
My practice originates in the darkroom. So I've got a really very particular relationship to the negative that kind of honors the first example in the photographic process of abstracting and kind of reverse engineering the process of light, leaving an imprint. And in the analog process, and even in the digital process, images are often spoken of as being fugitive, in the sense that they're contained, but only for so long before they essentially want to kind of migrate back toward the light from which they originated. And obviously the attempt to stabilize and the attempt to archive and fix images is kind of an obsessive part of our culture, and one of the assumed powers of the photographic medium. So I'm always interested in the kind of the pause or the disruption of immediate understanding. And I also think that just in terms of light, to be able to prismatically flip from the perceived arrangement of colors in a field of view to this almost cognitive dissonant and yet unified opposite, just gives you a chance to kind of reside and pause in an abstracted space and begin to push your way back into meaning. I like that. I also think there's something very visceral about the colors. It's like, you know, on the piano, so often, particularly in jazz compositions, they're organized around the black keys, you know, and so there's this relationship between the harmonies and dissonance, melodies and so on. I think the same thing with color and with light in general. As you are asked, as you engage with a negative, you immediately hear this kind of a dissonant chord, which to me is actually a chord that I most like to work with in some ways. And it's the original, it's the point of origin for working photographically.
So we'll take this last question by Young Singh. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. And I urge both you, Glenn, and Sam to look at this as well, because it, you know, you might want to reference it. But it does ask, it states, for both artists, looking at slide photos, we don't get the sense of space, proximity, air, sound, and smell of the work you show. Could you talk about those elements? Could you talk about how those elements do or do not make part of your pieces, and whether you hope viewers will find them? Asking because from the slides, it feels like those senses of a place or a neighborhood is evoked as much as vision and memory. Thank you. So while you're answering this, I'm just going to go through your slides so people can see them, just FYI.
Do you mind if I just jump in, Sam?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I would say just very directly, first of all, just so you know, I have had a record that has been skipping in the background the entire time we've been talking, and it's literally somehow soothing to me. The sonic space is really important to me. I actually look forward to in slim margins. My younger son created what he called an anecdotal soundscape. And I provided him with some recordings and a concept that had to do with neighborhood, that had to do with like the sound, something that this gallery, various small fires, they have a corridor as you approach the courtyard that they call the sound corridor. And I was able to engage that with this very kind of textured, again, anecdotal in the sense that it was fleeting and fragmented, but also rhythmic, and kind of paid homage to the soundscape of Venice Beach and my personal process. So that crept in just very specifically that way. And the last thing I'll say is, if you look at this slide and you see the raking around Immaculate, you see this spiral raking. The gallery crew always chuckled when I'd show up, because I almost couldn't have a conversation until I went and got the rake and started at the center and just did a raking around the entire courtyard to just kind of like get it to this almost sort of textured, patterned space where I could then just feel that there was a bit of equilibrium. So those things that you allude to about sound, clinks and clanks of the gate, even the dust in my nostrils when I'm raking and sweeping in my front yard, or raking, that all that stuff plays a role.
Yeah, I would just add that I don't establish a hierarchy between the visual and other senses. I think that lately I've been really thinking about, because I also do performance and I collaborate with poets and singers and all kinds of people. So it's really important that there be a sort of proprioceptive stance within my installations as well, in which one could close their eyes and still feel like they could reach out and experience what is around them and take the work in from a different non-visual standpoint. And I'll just read this really quickly. The initial step of any work I create is motivated by a basic idea. Image on paper carries psychological, conceptual, and aesthetic power. The material and the work intersect in many ways. My drawings, prints, objects, and paper installations include abstraction of natural landscapes, namely abounding forests and open space. I write in my artist statement that the installations are fear, anxiety, and memory translated on flapping sheets. Ghosts congeal and bodies form in dark corners and hang about whispering until the inflection of their voices can be heard among the living. I think about how paper blows in the wind like the leaves of climbing ivy, like my projections of ghosts, imbuing fragility and ephemeral transformation of space, or how paper in the absence of breeze is still. Perhaps viewers feel this impression or context, but it's not a requirement. I would like viewers to, at the very least, encounter vastness and texture. And I hope that my work, the titles of my work, imply narrative and reference and opening into meaning. So I just wanted to read that because all of this comes down. It's very ephemeral, like nothing, there's no permanence to anything I make here. So I hope that adds to your question, and I hope that you get to see the work in person.
That was beautiful.
Okay.
That was
Thank
beautiful.
you.
So
Okay.
I really I need to ask one more question. And you started talking about ghosts, and you did. I know that we've been here for about an hour and 36 minutes, but I think it's really important, and I'd love for both of you to respond. But you do write about reimagining the traditional ghost story. And I'm also interpreting with Glen's work and just thinking about ghosts. There's something that you wrote, and if I can find it really quickly, these human emotions that are, and you refer to them as being provoked. And I think, like, fear is one, even laughter when we think about ghosts. But I'm also thinking about when Glen talked about communing with the ancestors through his work, um, ghosts, spirits, ancestors, things that are around us, reimagining and telling these stories. Can you talk a little bit more about specifically Sam? And I'd love for Glen to interject your attraction to this idea of the ghost story, and and yeah, just expand on that a little bit, because I think sometimes when we hear ghost stories, we can think of traditional, like woo boo, those type of ghost stories, and I'm interested in your interpretation and understanding of what that is.
Yeah, well, I think Greg Tate, who's a writer and a scholar I really love and admire, writes about so many books coming out of the kind of Black literary canon, focusing on the phantasmagorical, right? This kind of like otherworldly, like Blackness that is able to transcend death and live on and deal with oppression and deal with society and deal with angst, and just kind of like it's like escape the escape route, right, into a kind of immortality. And so I enjoy his writing on it, and I encourage everybody to look into it. But I would say that my first drawings really came out of reading like Black historical fiction, mostly about women in struggle and despair. And Beloved is a touchstone within this conversation, in which there is a prominent ghost character. And that really changed my perspective on what a hauntology could be. And also, when Sandra Bland was killed, I was the same age as her, right? And so I'm thinking about, okay, what is how can Sandra continue to kind of like have presence and space within these conversations that I'm trying to have about my own life and presence, and just trying to bring these people into the room that we've lost, right? So when I say I'm revising the traditional ghost story, we can think about Casper the Friendly Ghost and how someone could put a sheet over their head and be like, boo, I'm a ghost. Or we could also think of the Ku Klux Klan, right? So it's like, there's a lot of ways this could go. And there's a lot of super difficult very just purely violent imagery that can come up just from seeing a sheet on a person.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to really navigate this world of what does a ghost mean in the work? Is it a trace? Is it a memory? Or is it a depiction of a disembodied figure, or of a struggle? These days, like what's on the screen right now is earlier on in my career, and I was really more interested in figurative approaches to what I'm talking about. But these days, I'm trying to expand the concepts by finding things out in the world that already exist, that people have left as markers of their existence, and kind of bringing that into the space of an installation, if that makes sense. Thank you.
It does total sense. Thank you so much, Sam. Glenn, did you want to touch on?
I mean, if I was going to interject, I do think of the mesh of the chain link. It oftentimes has a kind of a web-like quality. It has a kind of like, so just viscerally for me, there's a quality of kind of temporarily but very fleeting stabilization of a moment that I may have seen or sensed, that has then escaped from or moved, but then also stories that have been told to me that are evoked by the material itself. I remember when my auntie chased me out the front door, and usually her chain link gate was always open, but this time it was closed, so I had to jump over it because I was going to get a whooping, and I ended up snagging my cheek, and this whole scar right here is from when my cheek got snagged on the chain link fence. Like stories that people tell, and they evoke very specific moments, and like I can't walk through the neighborhood without thinking about all of those moments, the ones that I know, the ones that I do not know, the bulk of which I do not know. But the evocation of the fabric of the neighborhood past, the vestiges of that neighborhood pushed into the future, the resilience, I guess, the interplay between anonymity, or a ghost that wants to assert a specificity, like, you need to know who I am, you need to know, and then retracts just as quickly. I think one more thing is like that the covenant piece. The covenant piece is also a vestige, it's a trace of a spirit or a mentality of erasure, and it gets reinscribed over and over again in this weird tension between it as a real estate sign and a cross. So I was sort of playing with the idea of covenant as being this divine or mystical agreement, and I think that we're still dealing with the fallout and the haunting of those structural agreements in our neighborhoods right now. I think trying to work your way to the surface of reestablishing a stakehold is about contending with, not ghosts, if you will, of the past, that are haunting our present.
Right. Well, even when you talk about the covenant piece here, and Sam brought up the Ku Klux Klan, I remember when I first saw this piece in your studio, and the charred edges or the ends of this structure recall, right, the Klan burning crosses on the lawns of Black families' homes. If you think of then it going further, burning down entire communities, Black communities, and it's a heavy loaded object.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both for being here. I am so excited and honored to have hosted you, and I am grateful for you making time to talk to each other and to be with Conversations About Abstraction. Thank you, everyone who joined us and stayed with us. And again, I thank all of you who will make time to watch the recorded version, which will exist on our YouTube channel. Have a beautiful, beautiful day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you. Much
Nice to talk
respect
to
to
you,
both
Glenn.
of you. Much respect.
Thank you.
Peace.
Bye.